Hello and welcome to Conversations with Catholics. I am very excited today to have a returning guest, Thomas. Thomas, what's going on?
Oh, hello. How are you doing, Kevin? It's great to see you, and I'm so excited and appreciative that you're letting me back on the show. I think today's topic will be worth everybody's time for sure.
Yeah,
It's
we
very, very relevant.
oh, for sure. And we generated a lot of conversation, a lot of passionate conversation with the last episode
Yes.
about contraception. And abortion, I think, is only more of a hot button topic than contraception. So I expect that we will
It is.
generate the same, if not more, passionate conversation today as we did last time. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, especially like this is a really relevant and important topic for us to discuss because, especially if you're in American context, although obviously, like American culture defines kind of the Anglosphere culture, this issue is no longer in the abstract backseat now. This is very real, and this is immediately affecting real people's lives. And that's something that we used to have the luxury of not having to deal with, right? We could always have kind of abstract opinions and ideas on, the question of abortion and what that means. But now we no longer have that luxury, and now it's time to talk about this.
Yeah, for sure. Um, and if there's just kind of one place that I would like to start, I think for my audience, that would be kind of just like where I'm at with the abortion question, and
Yeah,
that's just because
absolutely.
I haven't spoken about abortion, I think, a single time on my channel, like ever. Um, so just so that my audience kind of knows where I am coming into this. So obviously, I grew up like very staunchly pro-life, like as pro-life as you could be, right? You know, you're trad, and to a large extent, I still am pro-life. Although, if I walked around telling everybody that I'm pro-life all the time, and then people heard some of my views, I think they would get kind of angry at me for calling myself pro-life when like maybe I'm less pro-life than they like wished I would be. So we'll kind of probably get into my views a little bit during our conversation because I do tend on kind of jumping in and uh, not representing the Catholic perspective because I can't really do that. But I will kind of just try to push back a little bit every now and then when I can,
Yeah.
just to kind of like, flesh out the conversation. Um, but I think with that out of the way, I'm happy to kind of just jump into it. And I know that you have a bunch to say about this topic. So where do you want to start us off?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kevin. So I think the most important place to start this conversation, especially from a Catholic perspective, is can you actually be Catholic and pro-choice, right? And in order to answer that question, we have to distinguish the difference between you personally and your personal moral views or your personal moral actions and legislative policy, right? These aren't the same thing, right? Like, I can, promote and support and vote for religious liberty, but that doesn't make me an apostate, right? In the same way, right, that we can vote for, say, maybe for your personal reason, may say, hey, you know what, we should allow the legality of divorce and remarriage, or sex outside of marriage, or using contraceptives, or viewing pornography, right? These are all legal, questions that you can say, hey, you know what? According to the law, I think that these should be permitted. However, as a Catholic, I have strong moral objections to these. And so then I wouldn't want to do those. And I would encourage others not to do those. And those always have been separate, right? And this is one of these issues that, unfortunately, like, it's
Pornography.
really not that complicated. You know, we do this in every other issue in our lives. But when it comes to the abortion issue, people want this to be different. And the rationale is always going to be, right, like, well, the apostate question, well, that's okay because that's a religious question, right? And so, we've accepted, that doesn't have, like, the civil law doesn't have to enforce church law. And within terms of, these other issues, right, that we do say, hey, you know what, the state actually has a definitive moral obligation to ban these. We always use the natural law argument. That is like, well, why is this not just my personal moral belief? This is something that I can and actually I'm required to impose on other people. And this is where, whether people admit it or not, right? When you make that argument, it automatically means that you're also making an argument of all those other issues that, the natural law doesn't say that, well, we can't use pornography or have sex outside of marriage or be divorced and remarry. Um, and that's something, of course, like a lot of people are not very honest with, right? Um, Go ahead. You were going to say something?
Yeah, so I guess just like the first thing that kind of jumps out to me is that, and like again, I'm putting on the pro life hat here to some extent because I legitimately wear it, and I might also kind of trump it up a little bit for the sake of a good conversation. But the first thing that jumps out to me is that, well, the pro life position is that abortion is murder, right? So it's not necessarily surprising that Catholics want to treat something like the legality of eating meat on Ash Wednesday as something that's different than abortion. Why? Because abortion is more akin to something like murder or theft. And actually, we just got a comment right here that says, and this is from Honestly Atheists too, says, should this reasoning extend to murder or theft, etc.? And so I think that's, even though Honestly Atheist is an atheist, I think this is like a good question. I guess we're both putting on our Catholic hats today. So
Well,
what's kind of the response there?
yeah. So this is kind of what we're getting back to the natural law argument, right? Is that there are certain moral principles that are universally accessible to everyone. And I actually really love the fact that your, atheist friend here brought up theft and murder, right? The atheist has no compulsion or like second thinking of like, hey, whatever pluralistic society we might have, and like maybe that's really good. Um, yeah, but there are like standards that like apply to everyone, right? And obviously people are like, well, theft and murder. And of course the answer is yes, right? And so now the question becomes is banning abortion like murder and theft? Right? If a society, for example, said, "Hey, you know what? Uh, murder is perfectly acceptable here in this country. You can kill whoever you want." Obviously, that would be a deep, like profound, a broken society, and of course, like I mean, because again, the thing is when the abortion issue is, pro-lifers try to make the argument, like, well, this isn't about my Catholicism, right? This is about, universal morals. And so you can't even say, well, a Catholic would be opposed to that. Well, anybody would be opposed to that, right? Free license for murder it obviously has to be opposed. I mean, that's just an unacceptable, social society. And so the question now becomes, with the issue of, abortion, is like, is it murder or is it not? Right? Obviously, there are very few pro-life people, and I would actually even describe as that if you don't view it this way, you're not really pro-life. You might have like political affinities, or you might want to vote with them, right? But really, you're not part of this group if you don't view it as murder, right? Because if it wasn't murder, right, we could have a moral, discussion, debate of like, well, what is the best policy, right? And of course, this is distinguished, like, I run into this all the time, is that people saying, well, why do you have restrictions if it's not murder? I'm like, well, not all things that are bad are murder, right? I mean, I could say, hey, I like think we should legalize drugs, but that doesn't mean that I think unlimited consumption of, drugs with no restrictions is good for society. Because I think it's like, well, yeah, it causes issues. And so we can have a debate as a democratic people of like, okay, well, should we have, minimal age of 21 or 18, or we can talk about those.
So the argument goes something like this. We can regulate abortion differently than something like murder because abortion is not murder. That's kind of like the, if I could distill what you just said into, a single sentence, that's kind of where it is right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And and of course, like the pro-life position is the fact that, well, no, that's not the case, right? We can't have this, negotiation over a societal evil or, something that's sinful, wrong, destructive to families. You know, it has to all be banned because this is a matter of core moral principles. And the consequences, frankly, don't matter, right? Because, like, in the same way, you wouldn't say, hey, you know what, like, I think we should pass a law that allows, people to break into anyone's home that they want, right? Like, well, no, we can't really have a negotiation about that, right? Like that has to be a bare minimum starting point for societal well-being, right? And so now the question becomes of like, is this murder? And my first thing that, before we kind of get into this issue, we a little bit skipped. You talked about how you had always been very staunchly pro-life when you had grown up. Um, I've never been pro-life in my entire life,
Really?
not for 1 second.
Wow.
And I grew up in an extremely conservative family. Most of them, were very pro-life. I was a traditionalist for a while, where, for those who don't know and just kind of inform, I had a whole year of my life where, I refused to go to the Novus Ordo at all, you know, that kind of tratty, and, through all of those stages, I've never been pro life. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that, when some of my earliest memories that I have are of being a little kid running through the snow from my father's shop into his greenhouses in February, where we would grow the plants. This is where I grew up. I grew up, you know, around plants and animals that we sold, uh, and so as far as like a modern man goes, like it's very traditional lifestyle. Close to the earth and to soil, to be you know connected with the cycle of life and the patterns of the seasons. Um, and I think this is where my obviously I didn't understand what like pro-life or pro-choice meant until like I was in high school. Like, I was a kid. Um but that growing up in that life is that, like, well, of course, when it comes to this question about like ensoulment, right, is that, well, of course a seed isn't an oak. It's just not. And when you grow close, up in the world, close to the earth, and you're in contact with the natural environment, this is actually very intuitive, right? We just know that those aren't the same thing. And also we know that, like, well, yeah, like we have to restrain sexual procreation, right? If you allow the weeds and the wheat and everything in the field to multiply however they want, it always leads to chaos and eventually death and starvation. That's really what that means, right? And so we have to regulate, procreation. And this process, right, was always just very intuitive to me. I never really thought about it. When I got into high school, really kind of what broke into my mind about this was the pro-life group came to protest at Notre Dame, which Notre Dame is across the street from my high school, because Obama had come there to speak on, being pro-choice. And so the first time this topic became a point of discussion, and so I talked to lots of pro-life people, what they thought. And it was like immediately just like, yeah, that's nuts. It's totally delusional.
Yeah, well, so
So
growing
I've
up,
been pro-choice ever since.
yeah, something I will share is I've been to the Right to Life March in Washington D.C. Um,
I have not.
I only went. 2 years, and I believe I was like 10 and 11 years old or something. So this was over a decade ago. It was a decade and a half ago or whatever. I forget how old I am. But um, I guess I have a question for you if you don't mind, and I hope I don't like kind of derail where we're going. But
Okay.
um, with regard to the greenhouse and like, hey, look, an acorn is not an oak tree kind of type deal. You're not going to necessarily hear a whole lot of pushback about like from me about an acorn not being an oak tree. Um, so anybody who's watched my channel for any amount of time knows that I'm a nominalist, right? So I don't actually
Yeah.
believe in these universals. So like, and I'm even willing to, I will take the very controversial stance and say that like, yes, a human fetus is not the same thing as an adult human being. Controversial, I know, but like obviously that's true. But here's kind of like the response that I give and the response that I hear a lot, um, and it's that okay, yeah. So we know that a human fetus is not the same thing as an adult human being, but we're generally not so concerned with like we're like it's only wrong to end the life of an adult human being. We
Mm.
generally think it's wrong to end the lives of all human beings. Um, needlessly, right? Like not counting war and stuff like that. So I guess what would like I guess how does your case kind of handle somebody kind of making that objection? Like, hey, look, it's not about whether the human is adult or child or fetus. It's about whether the human has like whether that organism has human DNA or something like that.
Yeah. Um, uh, and a really good question. I'm going to answer that, but I just kind of like realize I do want to kind of, because obviously this is for like Catholics specifically. So one of the things that people are going to bring up a lot is that, well, there's an automatic excommunication, right? Applied to if you have an abortion. You can go look up in canon law. And people will cite this as being like, if you're pro choice, right, you can't be Catholic. Now, of course, that canon isn't about your political policies, right? It's about you personally having an abortion. And yes, it does
Mm.
say for an abortion at any time period, right? So it doesn't discriminate, which of course was changed, right? Because that's not always how it used to be. That change happened in 1869, and actually only applied to doctors when it came to early term abortions. You know, for ever since we've had an excommunication applied to abortion, it's always been for the formed fetus. That's the term we used, right? Where the formed fetus is, this is now the time period of where this is a person, right? It's not just, a potential life, a potential person. It is a person. And, um, it wasn't until then, 1917, that excommunication finally was the first time applied to a woman, right? The mother, you know? Um, and so this teaching is actually very recent, and I think this is actually one of the reasons why, even as like a very hardcore, traditionalist, I never saw any issue, with this. It's just like, yeah, I mean, it's just a very modern, like moral theory. Um,
Yeah, so maybe what I'll ask is this: what's your view of like ensoulment, or if you want to be a little bit more secular, like when do you think like personification happens? I understand that the official position of the church, used to be like a formed fetus, and today it's moment of conception. But I guess
that
where
is
are
that's very
okay.
important.
I'm glad
This
that
is a
we're
big misconception.
okay. And I may have just skipped a lot of background that you were planning on getting there. So don't answer my question if you think we're too early. But
Just a quick answer:
okay.
no. The church has never taught when ensoulment is ever.
Interesting.
There's no time period.
Okay.
And by the way, this isn't just, Thomas's opinion. Trent Horn, says this,
Okay.
right? You can go to look at catholicanswers.com and they'll say this.
Um
Church has not ever taught when ensoulment happens. That is up to each individual Catholic to decide when they think that happens.
So let me see if I can like formulate my question without jumping ahead, because I feel like we're gonna wind up getting there too, and we can do it more in depth. But um, uh, is your view that ensoulment or personification does not occur at conception?
No. And we're going to go
Okay.
over exactly why not only does not but like it's philosophically impossible to say that that happens at the moment of conception.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
It's
Let me
I would
not
say
pry further, because I know we're gonna cover this and more. So let me kind of hand the microphone back to you and keep going. I'm sorry. It's just I.
yeah. No, these are good questions though. Um, so first off, I think for anybody who doesn't understand this debate, and I think a lot of Catholics don't know this, right? Because again, you know, we just don't catechize people on this issue, right? For example, right here, where you were talking about, you assume that the church has a teaching on when ensoulment is. It doesn't. Now, what it does have, and this is where, you know, this kind of idea comes from, and honestly, very, ill-meaning people intentionally distort this, is that in the catechism, right? And so, this is the official teaching of the Catholic Church, is that we have to respect the dignity of all human life from the moment of conception unto natural death. That's what it says in the catechism. Now, that doesn't say when human life becomes a person. And of course, right, because here's the thing, if I take a piece of skin off of you, right? That's human life. It's alive and it's human. But we don't think that's a person, right?
I don't disagree there.
Right? And so the question, whether you come from it, like a nominalist or in even like a materialistic standpoint, or from Catholic perspective, right? Like the question about the soul. That's why we call it ensoulment, right? Is like, when does God individually create the soul, right? And then attach that to the body, right? And so this is why, the ancients, always ask a question about like, what is the form of man? Right? Because we don't believe, right? If I carve a statue in the shape of a human being, that doesn't have a soul, right? Every rock and tree doesn't have a soul. That's, a person, right? We're not animists. We don't believe in that. There has to be some distinct physical form that we're like, aha, that is human, and now is a person. And so, and of course, for 90% of the church's history, right? The answer to this for virtually all Catholics, the answer was, well, at quickening or thereabouts, right? And this, obviously different, people have in different interpretations exactly when the quickening, obviously, like literally speaking, it's like when when the fetus kicks, right? However, theologians, like Saint Augustine, thought like this was at about 6 months, right? It was like when ensoulment happens. Now we're most commonly familiar with Aristotle's, position on this, which had a lot of influence on the culture of the church. And that is, 40 days for males and, and 80 days for females. Now, and of course, like Aquinas then takes this and he also agrees with this. And the thing is, like, the Catholic teaching, followed this, right? Like this is why the excommunication and really every canon and discipline of the church showed that like we do not treat the ending of uh, life in the early term. That's not treated as murder, because we just don't treat it that way. Now, that is different for late term abortions, right? And this has always been very consistent. Late term abortions have always been seen as killing a innocent person. Um, and I think this is something that, like, even when we see today, like, of when people actually have abortions, right? The level of moral objection increases quite rapidly, like, when we get to the later terms of pregnancy, right? People are just like, yeah, you know what? If you got, a 6-month-year-old, pregnancy, like, look, maybe it's not a person, but damn, like, I really think it's a person. And like, yeah, and I like, if I knew my brother or sister who did that, like, I couldn't look at them the same ever again, right?
I've been trying not to interrupt, but I'm sorry. It's all it's all bubbled up. So this exact point is something that I actually had like it was on my list of questions, and that's um your point about like, well, where's the line? Well, certainly 6 months, right? And then you'd be upset enough that you wouldn't be able to look your sibling in the eye. But 1 week is and don't let me put words in your mouth, but 1 week is certainly something very different than 6 months. Okay. Um, when
Yes.
when I think about things, I certainly agree that a 1 week old fetus is in a very different stage of development than a 6 month old fetus. Like, I certainly, yeah, I can't argue with that, right? But where I do kind of like have my worries is like, okay, where do we draw the line? And like, evidently, we have to draw the line somewhere, right? If the line, like, if there is a line, it must be drawn somewhere, right? So we could have no
Yeah.
line at all and say it's always fine to murder humans whenever,
So
or it's never fine. But if there is a line, then it seems like we have to, or maybe we should have a reason. And if we don't, like,
yeah. So, this gets back to that. This is the question about, like, the natural law and how do we, like, answer that question, right? What is the a priori knowledge that we have about what is right and wrong, that, again, we don't have to teach to anyone, right? And therefore we can hold all human beings morally accountable to this universal standard. And that the natural law has been always very clear. It's at birth, right? At birth, it is indisputable that we now have a moral obligation to protect this person, and therefore it's also a person. Now, go ahead.
So maybe it's just
You
the
don't like
fact that
that
when
answer.
well, so no, maybe it's just the fact that like when I hear natural law, like I have like heart
Well,
palpitations. I just it's the non-Catholic in me that I just do not like the concept of natural law in general. But trying to put that to the
well,
side,
that's because people who talk about the natural law systematically abuse it in really ugly, grotesque ways. However, the real nature of it, like, this is the philosophical principle of, like, how can we hold any universal moral standard in a pluralistic society at all, right?
yeah, I mean that's a great
Like,
question.
why is genocide bad? Like, well, I mean, obviously, we voted here in my country. We don't want genocide, but, like, well, I mean, if people are committing genocide over in their country, I mean, they have a right to, like, choose that.
Yeah, I don't want to get super derailed on the morality point, but maybe what I will say is just your statement that like natural law has always been very clear that like ensoulment or personification perhaps only it's when the baby is born that it matters. Um that is I'll call it news to me. And I guess I'm just
Well,
looking to see if you could
here's how
flesh that out
we
a little
answer
more.
this. What society, what people in all of human history thought, hey, you know what? It's born. We can kill it now. That's super morally acceptable. It's also because it's not a person, not because we don't like it, right? It's not a person.
Well, some cultures thought like that.
No, and see, this is, I think, is, like, really important when we think back then. Is like, we often in our modern perspective, we think that people viewed, right, and they're like, oh well, if we kill this person, they're not a person. right? Or if we enslave this person, it's not a person. People weren't confused that it's a person. They just didn't believe that person had certain rights. And the reason we have this issue is because we are so enculturated with universal, equal human rights, which is not a thing that ancient societies had any idea about, right? This idea that, well, if I have this right, then you must have that right too, because you're a person. That's a very new concept in the world. And so when we look back, people didn't say, oh, well, I'm going to leave my child up on the hill, right? Because I don't want to take care of it. By the way, do you know why they left him up on the hill and they didn't just chop off their heads or something?
To see if they were like tough enough, right?
No, because, well, you take an infant, right, and you put it up on a hill and you abandon it. It doesn't matter how fit that child is, right? They left it up there because they knew it was wrong to kill the child because it's a person to directly kill. And so rather than to directly kill the child, you expose it. And this is how we're able to justify this moral, action is that, well, I'm not actually killing this person, right? I'm just letting nature take its course.
Um, Perhaps. Something else that occurs to me though is that like there are cultures that like just straight up did murder babies. Um, and like two that come to mind are I guess ancient Judaism, right? Like there's that psalm about how happy we will be to dash the babies of our enemies against the rocks or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and like granted for the Jews it wasn't
Well,
Jewish babies. It was like hey, it's fine to kill babies as long as they're not Jewish. Um, but then there's
but this
also
is
there's also like
war,
the
right? It's
like
war. And again, those are people. This is the thing. This is the thing. Like, it, no one is confused that it's a baby, that it's a person, right? That's not the question, right? This is what I mean. It's a universal. When a child is born, it's a person. Everyone knows that. No one has to teach you that. No one disagrees on that. The question is like, well, should we kill this baby or not? Right? If you're in
okay.
war, right? Hey, you know what? It's our enemies. Like, yes, we're going to scorch earth. And all the way down to the babies, right? We're going to scorch earth, right? If it's a sacrifice, right? In pagan societies where you would take these, newly born infants and you would burn them on an altar, right? You know why you burned them on an altar after they were born? Because they were people. And therefore, it was a greater sacrifice to give a person to the gods.
Yeah, I might just not be convinced that like the modern concept of personhood existed back then. You know what I mean? Because like even when I think about like just America 200 years ago, where it like black folks were only considered to be 3/5 of a person, right? Um,
But that's not true.
no.
That's not true. They had two-thirds of the right to vote, but they were people. No one ever confused that they weren't people. This is what I mean is we're so trapped in this universal rights, right? Like, okay, this is a perfect example with the voting, right? You're like, well, I must not think you're a person because I'm not willing to give you equal rights that I do. Well, ancient society was based on unequal rights, right? The idea of having equal rights merely based on your humanity was considered an injustice, right? Because human beings are naturally not equal. And therefore, it would be unjust to give equal rights to everyone. And I think this is the same thing with, whether it's voting or enslavement, right? Or, genocide or war, right? Like it's not that these aren't people, it's that these people no longer have the right to life, right, for whatever various reasons that we consider justified, right?
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with the amount that I've derailed you so far. So let me kind of let you get
No,
back on
so
it.
good. No, I'm glad we did this because I think this is really good, especially for a secular audience, but also just like everybody. I think this is something that people have a really hard time wrapping their heads around, right? Like, okay, how can a slave, right? It's in scripture, right? It says, he's my money, right? And so you're like, okay, well, so Did the Old Testament teach, if you were enslaved that you no longer were a human being now? No. It's that you've lost the rights to your labor. You've lost your rights to bodily autonomy, right? And this is a thing that, like, for ancient people, separating those two concepts was not just not hard, like, it was universal, right? Every individual person had different rights. There was different rights if you were a man or if a woman, if you were a husband or a wife or a child, right? If you were of the ruling class, were you a nobleman? Were you a commoner, right? You had different rights. And this is like so ubiquitous that this is something that's like very easy for them to understand versus us. The idea that like the president, right, could have different like rights before the law, right? Like, let's say the president can, like, if he commits a crime, right, it's not a crime because those crimes don't apply to the president, right?
Are we speaking
uh
about modern presidents by any chance?
yeah.
Like presidents who
Oh
might have
yeah.
been president within the last 5 years, perhaps? Okay.
Oh yeah. So, but the idea that the president or a congressman can just systematically ignore the law because they're above the law, right? Because really, when you say you're above the law, what you're saying is the law applies to some people, but not to me. Different laws apply to me. Does that mean that we somehow think that, like, you know, that means I'm human because this law applies to you, but not to me? Right? And so when you really start to kind of break apart these philosophical assumptions, even in our own society, right, we understand this to be true, right? Same thing when we deprive the labor and the freedom and the bodily autonomy of criminals, right? Have we said that those are no longer humans? I mean, nobody actually thinks that prisoners aren't human. They're just like, well, for reasons that we think are justified, we have removed certain rights of them. So they now have less rights. But it's not like we turn them into cows or they're like chimps, right? And so, this is, I think, these are also issues that, again, we didn't ever have to like really struggle with, right? Because the abortion issue really like opens this can of worms, right? Because it really because like at birth, right, we can all pretend that all human beings all have equal rights and not think about it, right? And before then, well, now we have to start distinguishing these things. And of course, this is where we get to the issue where what people talk about bodily autonomy, right? When people are saying like, well, I'm pro-choice, right? One of the big things is bodily autonomy, right? And a lot of pro-lifers really hate this argument, right? I know. I've heard it. They just get all wooey. So they're like, my body, my choice. And they're always like, but see, that's not your body. And we all, we go nowhere, right? But what does that really mean when it comes to bodily autonomy, right? Is the saying, it's like, okay, well, uh, you know, because you are a pregnant person, you should have your rights removed, right, of bodily autonomy. Now, that might be justified, right? Because I mean, that's the real pro-life argument, right? Is that well, women should have their rights stripped away from them because when we strip away those rights, they protect the rights of another person, right? Um, and when it comes to this question of like murder, I think this is, for me, when I ran into the pro-life, movement, um, everybody that I talked to, right, I was like, you really think this is murder? They're like, yes, of course, absolutely. And I'm like, okay, so we still have you're still a patriot, right? You're not, starting a civil war. You're not trying to overthrow the government. Shoot, you're not even doing the bare minimum of like, like Gandhi style, right? Where like, we're all just going to sit in the street and refuse to do anything until the law is changed.
Some do.
People go on their lives and nothing's happened.
Yeah, so I the church that I went to that my grandparents founded, there was somebody who went there who was actually in jail for a long time when I was growing up because he bombed an abortion clinic. So some
Which, by the way, if abortion is murder, if it is a murder, every single person who believes that has to say that that is a morally acceptable option to respond to. Now, they might say it's not prudent, they might not encourage it, but you cannot morally condemn that man, right? In no more way than you can say, well, if you're part of the resistance against the Nazis and you go and blow up a train station
that's right.
because it's moving supplies to go to the concentration camp, are you going to say, well, that's not morally acceptable? Terrorism has to be a morally legitimate option. If there's really murder going on, right? And this is where we get kind of the full like cuckoo crazy absurdity stuff, right? Where in the United States we've had 63 million abortions since Roe. 63 million abortions. If this really is murder, right? Then what the United States has done is less evil than if we had passed a law in 1973 that says any black person in America you can kill for whatever reason you want, right? Like if you just see them, right, and they're just like walking around and you don't like them, and then Americans systematically killed every single African American in the United States. And I don't believe anyone if they say if that was really happening in this country that they would respond the way they are doing today, because we all know that is murder. We all know that would be murder. We would absolutely melt it, and people would be in the street with their guns trying to overthrow the government, of just like we'd be arming people to resist and protect themselves. We like and this isn't just a theoretical thing. Like this kind of stuff happens in societies, right? When you have like the government just like, well, genocide's okay now, right? There's always long sustained acts of political violence and aggression, because that's what happens, because that's murder, and people know that. And this is where like I really respect people who want to value the life and take seriously or have moral problems with abortion, right? I'll be totally honest, right? Like as a Catholic, right? Like I have never thought that abortion is a moral good. It's always got to be evil, right? And not because it's murder, right? But it's a for whatever situation you were in, right? You now have to destroy an icon of Jesus Christ, right? That's really what's happening here, right? And just in the same way that I think that, like, when you talked about the honoring the body, um, you know, I would see as like morally reprehensible that somebody to just take some, like let's say if I died, right? If I died and somebody just dumped me in a trash can, right? Like that's really morally reprehensible. But when it comes to the question of like murder, I'm like, I just don't believe that this is murder. And I don't believe that anyone else does. And that's the problem, is that like it's all a fantasy. And of course, like it was meant to be this, right? This isn't an accident, right? And this is why the pro-life movement is something of, the mid 20th century here in the United States.
Yeah. So if you just saw me nodding a lot here, it's because I pretty much agree with most of this part. Here's kind of my 2 cents, and I wonder if you'll have
Well, let
anything.
me give
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
But I give us more historical context, right? So we go back to Roe, right? So of the 9 justices, right? Uh, you know, 6 of those were Republicans. 5 of them voted for Roe. The overwhelming majority of conservative justices back in Roe was like, yeah, the state as a society, like we can't decide definitively on this moral question, right? This isn't a matter of human rights of like, hey, you know what? Like, because in the Constitution, right, it says we have a right to liberty, life included, right? And it's saying like, well, this is not a universal question to life, right? This has to be up to the decision of the mother. Now, we do place where we say it's like, hey, after the moment of like when the child could potentially not be dependent on the mom, right? We're going to leave it up to the voters. And again, like every society, right, at the moment of birth, we're like, yeah, but now it's different now. And of course, this gets down to is like, you know, when you get citizenship in the United States, right? It's when you're born. It's not when you're conceived. It's not when you hit the first trimester or the second trimester, right? It's when you are born. And I think this is like the very reason why, like, the church itself doesn't baptize you when you're conceived, or even if you have a miscarriage and the child is still alive outside the womb, we don't baptize them.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah.
And the reason I ask is because, like a family friend of
Right here in the
ours.
Summa, Thomas Aquinas specifically talks about this, and he recommends that we should. We should change the practice, right? Because he thinks that after about 40 to 80 days, depending on the sex, right? This has a soul, and so we should baptize. But he uses this of saying is like, right, like this is a clear moral indication that like what is happening before birth, right? Is this not the same? It's just not the same.
Yeah, the reason I ask if you're sure about that is because I seem to remember a few like rather morbid cases, I suppose, of women who knew that their baby was going to be dead within minutes of being born, if it was even, if it even survived the process of birth at all. Um, so they kind of like went into the hospital and they delivered a baby that they knew would either be dead before it was born, but they do it anyway. And there's a priest there, and the priest baptizes. And I know of cases where the priest like baptizes like a dead baby, like the baby died at some point like prior to the delivery, but they baptize it anyway, like just in case, kind of, I think.
Yeah.
And I know that some of these occur like 6 months and 7 months and stuff like that, so that's like really early.
But this has never been a universal practice, right?
Okay.
What some individual priest does or doesn't do, right? I mean, if I brought up every individual, well, hey, I knew a priest that did this,
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, everything under the sun would be like, well, this is what the Catholics do. No, that's not what the church, promotes and promulgates. That is not her official position. It's not even a common practice or standard practice, right? It's some guy did this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's never been the case that the church has ever made any kind of statement to the effect of, hey, it's fine to do this as a rule. It's just that individual priests have done it. That's kind of what's going on.
Yeah, well, and a great example is like with a baby who's passed away, right? I mean, Catholic teaching unambiguously is clear that like you cannot baptize a dead body. There's no person there. You
Um,
can't baptize.
I'm really reaching on this
You have
one,
to
but
baptize a person.
I, I,
You have to
s-
baptize a person.
I seem to remember this idea that like the soul might linger in the body for like up to a certain number of hours after death. That's why they'll give
So
extreme
this,
unction to dead people. Like if you died 10 minutes ago,
so
they're
this
not going to
is
not do extreme unction, kind of.
yeah. Now, extreme unction is a good example, right? Because they will do that even after you're dead, even though they shouldn't. Really, it actually comes from like a Jewish tradition. This is why even like Lazarus, when Jesus, went to raise Lazarus from the dead, he waited several days because this is a common kind of like folk belief, is that of the lingering soul inside the already dead body, right? And this actually, like, this is like a really good place to like bring out the discussion about, like, again, like, what is really the form of man, right? When is there a soul here, when is there not a soul here, right? And the really actually the best place to look is at death, right? So, you know, we, you know, and again, this is that thing about, like, is it human, right? Make this argument, right? Like, well, it's human, right? It's alive. It's got a body, right? And, therefore it's a person. Well, when does a person die? Well, when they stop being a person, right? And the thing is that, and this is the practice, right? This is the universal practice, right? Like, if your heart, right, stops beating, that doesn't mean you're dead, because we'll pump it for you, right? If you stop breathing, you're not dead. We will breathe. We will literally breathe for you, right? When death is considered to have happened is when the brain stops, right? You know, this is what happened with, like, my little brother, when we had to, pull the plug. It's like, it's the brain. And so what this is that our lived, experience of the moral life is that, like, well, here's the thing. The form of man at the very minimum must constitute the brain, right? If there's no brain, there's no person. It doesn't matter that all of your organs and body are perfectly healthy, alive, respirating, right? Um, because we can easily keep, the body alive even without a brain, right? We don't need the brain, right? We can breathe for you. We can feed you, right? We can continue to do all of these processes, right, for you. But when the brain stops, we say, well, now the form of man is gone, right? And then you could use a nominalistic, kind of thing of like interpretation with this. I don't think there's any necessarily, contradiction here. Um, but we can kind of look at the same question of like, okay, well, that's when life ends, right? In terms of, when personhood ends, right? Because we often, you interchange those, right? Because there's still life in that body. It's human life. Um, so when we go to like, why isn't, like, at the moment of conception, like, why isn't this the personhood, right? The moment of personhood. And, a lot of people try to say, well, okay, the reason we can say this is definitely a person is because it has unique DNA, right? Thomas, the reason why, if I pluck off, a piece of skin, right? Or we have a dead, body that still has like living organs, right? You know, um, if I cut off your finger, right? Like, that's not a person because, like, well, that's not a unique new DNA, right? And so that's just different what happens at conception, right? It's not me, and it's not me because it's not my DNA. It's not, like my partners, it's not them because it's not their DNA, right? And that's what constitutes, the new person. Of course, this obviously cannot be true. And the reason for that is then twins, right? Identical twins, one of them doesn't have a soul, right?
There's
Because
also conception problems with twins because sometimes twins are a single egg that splits into two. So it's like, wait a minute, like
they're physically intertwined. And yet, interestingly, at least in most cases, there are definitely exceptions where, that split happens sufficiently well. We consider there to be two persons, right? Even though they're one, interconnected, anatomical organism, right? Um, you know, We definitely think there are two people there. Now, the extreme on this, right? And so, well, right? So, because here's the thing, in order for ensoulment to know when ensoulment has to happen, there has to be a universal form, right? And so, if there's even one exception, that cannot be the form, right? Of when God, gives the soul to this body. And so, at the moment of conception, right now, some people might say, well, and this is a perfectly legitimate philosophical argument. Say, well, yeah, at the moment of conception, there is a soul, right? But in the case of twins, right, it's after the splitting occurs. Well, then God creates another soul for that one, right? And I think that's like very, philosophically, consistent. However, though, that means that the DNA can't be the defining, of like what is you as a unique person, right? Um, so now we have to ask of like, okay, if it's not, the same DNA, right? Well, maybe it's or that distinguishes us, right? Um, we get to like another very interesting case of like human chimeras, right? Where we say, well, are you familiar with this?
I don't think so.
Are you familiar with what chimera is? Yeah. So chimera is when actually a person has two sets of DNA.
Huh.
Uh, yeah. And what happens is that you'll have, non-identical twins that are conceived, and this can happen with any kind of organism, right? Obviously, it happens to people too, where the identical twins, right? When they're, after conception, right, they fuse together, and then they grow into a single organism.
That's morbid.
Well, so actually, most chimeras actually are unaware that they're a chimera
Sure.
until you right late in their life because they're totally normal looking people.
Right.
Now, there's some exceptions if you have like weird like pigment coloration differences. So, for example, if you're like one embryo was had black hair, genes for black hair, and the other embryo had genes for blonde hair, you're gonna have both going on in your head.
That's weird.
Yeah, and different spotches and stuff, Um, and so what we see here is that like my identity, my form isn't just determined just by all the DNA being the same either, right? And so DNA, whether it's a human or not human, can't be the define like that alone can't be what defines the form of man, right? And again, if we look at that question about like, okay, this is where it's like, well, they have potential, right? And this is, of course, is the argument of like, if I cut off a little piece of your finger, why is that not a person, right? And it's like, well, that's not a person, even though it shares the same DNA with you, right? We see it's like, well, that could mean it doesn't mean that it's not you. Um, and so when we remove that and say, well, it's not there because it doesn't have the potential to become an adult, right? If I cut off a little piece of your, skin, that can never become an adult, person. So therefore, that can't be a person. But the problem is with that argument is that's actually not true, and it's not science fiction or theoretical. We've done this, right? Where we can take your individual cell right off of your skin and then we put it in an environment where it forces the skin cell to revert back into a pluripotent stem cell.
Really? We can do that?
Yeah, we do it all the time now.
Wow, that's
It's big,
wild.
big part of research. So remember when we had like the ban on, embryonic, stem cells, the whole Bush controversy,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, the reason you don't hear about that anymore is because they don't need embryonic stem cells. They just,
Make them from other cells?
yeah, they just make them,
Wow.
right? Make them from any cell, right? And we've done that. We do this. We have human lines that we've done this with. We have human, pluripotent stem cells that we use for research purposes all the time now.
That's wild. I did not know that. That's super cool.
Yeah, and of course, like the hope is that, like, essentially, in the future, we'll be able to like grow organs from your own cells,
Yeah,
just like right off the bat. But we can also grow them into people,
which is like
and
so
we've done this,
scary.
right? We've done this with all kinds of, farm animals and et cetera, right? Lab,
Yes,
experimental.
Dolly
Now,
the lamb.
yeah. Now, according to legal ethical restrictions, I believe they have to like terminate it. The if you allow, the embryo to keep developing under like a normal condition, you have to terminate it at, I don't know, whatever weeks it is. I'm not super familiar with all of the technical stuff, but at some point you have to terminate it. But if you allow it to keep growing, it will grow into a full person. We can do this. And so this is where I have the problem is that, like, people are saying like, well, you know, it's a person because it could be a fully grown adult. And I'm like, well, every single cell in your body could be another person, right? And this is even true with, like, again, you don't even have to have this, even back to the identical twins, right? Where did that other twin come from? Well, it came from the potential, right, of a cell that was, in normal conditions would have grown up into just one person. Well, now that cell is like, well, and under these conditions, I can now leave now, right? I
Yeah,
can go become a person.
yeah. So it's exactly
Got
for
an
this
induction?
reason. Yeah, so it's exactly for this reason that I just don't think that like potentiality is like an actual way of like the universe doesn't work like that. Um,
No,
yeah, it's just
no,
like
it's bonkers.
it's it's medieval science is what it is. Like
It's
potentiality and
not,
act.
well, not when it comes to, ensoulment though.
That's where you're going to lose me, obviously, right? Because I'm not Catholic, so I don't
Yeah,
think that ensoulment is like a real thing either. Um,
no,
but I do think that all of your points here about just how cells work does demonstrate that the whole concept of potentiality, I think, is just a concept that is just grounded on well, I'm going to call it medieval pseudoscience, but and you may disagree with me, and that's fine. Um,
no. I disagree with it because that's not, I mean, when we were trying to make this like, argument, right, of like, is a thing because it potentially could be a thing? That's not a medieval argument, right? It's a thing because it is a thing, right? And this is where, like, Aquinas, this is why he taught about, and everyone else, like, at the moment of conception, right, it's a human being, right? Because it's human, right, and it has the potential to become a human person, but that doesn't make it a human person, right? It's just a human being. And, but he's views, right, that this has a vegetative soul, right? Just like, again, if I take out an organ, it has a vegetative soul. And basically, what this means is that, like, it's not a person, it's just acting like any kind of other living organic matter, right? Right. Um, and of course, too, like when we look at this, a lot of pro-lifers will be like, but you know what, this is all based. The reason we have to change this is because now we have like good science, right? And the science of then was, the only reason the ancients thought that is because, the ancients just didn't have good science and they just didn't know that, there was, human matter, right? There was like identifiable human being, before ensoulment. But the problem is like that's not actually what they believed, right? Aquinas said that like it has a human soul, but not a divine, supernatural soul, right? That's indestructible. It has the same soul that, like, if you cut off my nose, it has a human vegetative soul. I mean, yeah, it's human, it's alive, but it doesn't have an immortal soul. Um,
Sorry, I just thought that was funny. I wanted to pull it up. Just talking about the medievals, Aquinas also probably thought semen was maybe he did. Sorry.
no. Oh, that is actually the recent, pseudoscience. This idea of, the connection of, seed, and like that is like the form of like a whole like person, right, exists already in the sperm. This is something that actually develops in the 16th centuries or 1600s, sorry. Um, and at the very end, like very, very end. And that's because looking under the microscope, looking at sperm, they thought they saw like the shape of a person, right? You know, and so this is where the pseudoscience that the pro life movement is based off of, right? Is this first misconception, right? Unlike the ancients who did not believe this, the first, idea of this didn't come until the 18th, 18th century of any popularity, right, or any prevalence, and that was on a misnotion of the biology of sperm, right? That's where that comes from. And you can go look up on this, they'll show, the little pictures of sperm and they look kind of like a dude, like a person, right? And they thought that, well, you see, the form of the man is already there, and all it needs is just the egg, right? And then boom, you have the whole form of a man. It's like a little person now, right? And this is the pseudoscience that the pro-life, idea had, and is based on, and it's still even to today, right? And I think there's some other things that we want to like get over, especially like back into like church history, right? And a lot of people don't believe that, like, well, no, that's not really how the ancients viewed this. And I'm like, well, here's the thing, the church has always had a small, very small minority view that, like, right, the distinction between the formed and unformed, is wrong, right? Well, that small minority never was church teaching all the way up until 1588. It's 1588 is the first time that the church ever said that all abortions should be treated as if, not that they are, but as if they are murder. First time, 1588. And this is the thing I have a problem with, like the natural law argument, right? It's like, well, if this is part of the natural law, right? How did even Catholics get this wrong all the way up? The first time was in 1588 that we figured this out, right?
And sorry, I got a super chat, and I do answer super chats right
Okay, we
away.
did it.
And this is from my friend John Buck. And I have a feeling that we were getting here and we just hadn't gotten here yet. But so John says, doesn't the Catechism, specifically Catechism of the Catholic Church, entry 2270 and 2275, teach an adamantly pro-life position?
Yeah. So of course, this is what everybody brings up, right? So thank you for your question. It's very pertinent. So we're going to go through first, this is the problem on, when I finish on my thought, right? 1588 was the first time this happened. It was 3 years later that promulgation was overturned because of how obvious it was to the ancient, just past, medieval time period, right? Mind of just like, this cannot be true, right? And this is the problem with the natural law argument. Now, when we get to the specific catechisms, statement, I think this is something that, when people read that, right, they've been told what it means. They haven't actually read what it says and what it really actually means, right? And so the church has certain requirements of us, right? However, just like any other, political position, right? There are prudential choices that we have to make, right? The church says that we need to respect life from the moment of conception up until death, right? However, oh, here we go.
Let's see if this helps.
Yeah, Kevin's doing us a little magic here.
There we go. So entry 2270. Do you want to read it? Actually, you can go ahead and read it if you want.
So human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception, from the first moment of his existence, a human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent being to life. Now we kind of go on.
Oh,
It's
sorry. I can put
it
that. Sorry
well,
about that.
it goes on. So he actually quoted through uh 22070 to 22075. And so, this is, first off, right? Like this is an aspirational proposition, right? You go on.
I can keep scrolling if you want me to, but I
Yeah,
think
yeah, you can keep scrolling.
sure. So I guess I'll read 2271. Since the first century, the church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to the moral law. 2272. Formal cooperation in abortion constitutes a grave offense. 2273, the inalienable right to life of every innocent human individual is a constitutive element of a civil society and its legislation. 2274 says it must be treated from conception as a person. The embryo must be defended in its integrity, cared for, and healed as far as possible, like any other human being. And 2275, these are like a bunch of different quotes, but it's immoral to produce human embryos intended for exploitation as disposable biological material.
Yeah, that's part of where we get into that.
Yeah.
Um, so this is what, of course, everyone quotes, and they say, well, see, here it's obvious that, right, you can't be Catholic, right, and be pro-choice, right. Here's a quote right here. So here's my first challenge, and everybody's right is that really what the church teaches, right? Or, as we see in practice, right, promulgated by every single pope and all the bishops, right, they give communion to every single pro-choice politician that's Catholic without any issue, and they have ever since Roe, right? And this is a thing where, like, whatever your personal interpretation, right, of those passages are, I want to just take back from a second. Is like the magisterium is more than just words in documents. It's the lived, actual lives of and the authoritative choices of the actual bishops and of the actual popes. Real world, right? We don't have a Gnostic religion and that's just like ideas up in our head, right? And so we ask that question of like, okay, how do we interpret that and how do we live that out, right? Nancy Pelosi is the only politician in America in all of history that's ever been denied communion, right? And excommunicated for her pro-choice stance. Now, that's by a bishop. There's been some like rogue priests who have done this, right? Which of course they have no, real authority to, permanently bar, you know. But like, and this is where I have a problem with, Catholics who, might not like whatever I have to say about, the rest of it, right? Your bishops know the correct answer. They all know that you can be pro-choice and Catholic. That's why they don't excommunicate pro-choice politicians. It's why they give them communion. It's why when the issue about their pro-choice stance, right? Nancy Pelosi, after being denied communion by her bishop, she immediately went to Rome. Because we're Catholic and we have a pope. Her bishop made his decision and his prudential judgment, right? And so Nancy Pelosi went to Rome to find the answer to this question. And she was given and received communion there. Right after this, right? This is what we have to understand is like that is the teaching of the church, right? Is that yes, Nancy Pelosi, a pro-choice Catholic, is Catholic.
Could
Same thing with Joe Biden. When the issue came up to vote, right? And there was a big question, like, right, is Joe Biden, Catholic because he's pro-choice? And here comes up some legislation. A lot of people are asking. You know what he did? He went to Rome. And then he received communion in Rome. Now, you might think that they should be denied communion, that they should, right, be excommunicated, and you can have that theological opinion, right? I think it's a bad one, but you can have that opinion. But to state that someone is not Catholic and that that is the teaching of the Catholic Church, that is flat out false. And there's no excommunication for it, and there's no canons against this. There are canons against you personally having an abortion. You can have an abortion, and guess what? There is an automatic excommunication applied to that. However, I think this is really important to realize that when people do this, right, what they are doing is they are cannibalizing the supernatural universal Catholic faith in order to turn it into a private club for short-term political angst. Around the rest of the world, this is not a question. Throughout historical periods in the church, this hasn't been a question. You and your very tiny little group here in America is obsessed with this. And there's one bishop in the history of all of Catholic teaching who agrees with you. One bishop. And this is where, like, just because you want it to be true doesn't mean it is true. And I think this is so important as Catholics, right? Like, to realize it's like, you cannot just make up these categories. Yes, does the church encourage us to defend the life of the unborn, to try as much as we can to protect absolutely every human life? Yes, it does. You look at it, John Paul II and Evangelium Viam, where this is like the big one. Even in there, he is very specific, right? That in order for us to be able to create laws, right, that make all abortion impossible, it must be connected with a wider program and project for providing for life of the family and changing society so that accepting life is actually like a normal, easy, positive thing to choose in one's life. What does that mean? That means that, we can have different prudential ways of like, how can we get about to the end point of reducing abortion, right? You might think that an outright ban might be the way to do it. That is a position you can have as a Catholic and say, you know what, the liberties and rights of, women, we should be able to remove those because it serves a higher moral purpose. But you can also, as a Catholic, being like, you know what, I don't think that's the most effective way of doing this, right? That there are serious problems. For example, number one reason women don't want to have their, pregnancy, all the way to term is because they have problems. They don't have a social net. They don't have resources. Their community is shaming them for being pregnant and out of wedlock, right? Cardinal Fernandez just put out a promulgation on this, right, of reminding everyone, right, that this is a huge problem of the machos in the church. That's his terminology, right, who want to attack and condemn and exclude young women who have chosen life, right? And so, yeah, if you would say, hey, you know what, I think society needs to change its moral values and standards, and we need to focus on building new structures in order to make bringing children in the world better. Yeah, as a Catholic, you can have that political opinion, just like you can have a political opinion of being a libertarian, which is nuts. You could be a fascist. right? You can be a fascist. You can be pro-slavery, right? You can be anti-abolitionist and you can be a Catholic. You can be a communist and be a Catholic, right? You can be an integralist, even though the church teaches very clearly in religious liberty, right? You can disagree with the church's teaching on that, right? You're still Catholic, even though you reject the basic, teaching of Vatican II on religious liberty. You
Don't
can
tell the new
still be
polity guys.
no. Well, I run into this problem all the time,
I'm sure
right?
you do.
Every day.
I bet you do. I
Um,
don't doubt it.
yeah, and this is what, and I ask. I'm just gonna make it's like a real deep question for Catholics. I want to get like very personal on this, right? When you do this, it is so ugly. And I think and I want to reach out to my pro-life Catholics. And I'm going to ask you, right, to take a minute to realize of how unbelievably ugly and toxic this behavior is. Not only is it not church teaching, right, but of how deeply exclusionary it makes other people. Which, by the way, right, like, unfortunately, sadly, for a lot of them, that's the whole point, right? They use the pro-life issue to push people they don't like out of the church. And it's ugly and it's gross and it's barbaric, right? And we have to stop this. And I give this even an example of, like, even in our modern American politics, which are so ugly and so divided, right? We do not systematically accuse the other side of not being American citizens, right? We don't say, well, you know what? Because you're not going to support, my position on guns, you're not an American. You should be excluded from citizenship of the United States. We don't do that because that's so ugly, right? And whether Catholics who say this realize it or not, you are doing the exact same thing, right? I mean, this reminds me of St. Paul when he's condemning one of the churches for the man who is having incest with his mother. And St. Paul condemns them and says, not even amongst the pagans, right, do they do things this badly. And I think this is what's the thing, this divisiveness of classifying people who have in no way have violated, right, their status as Catholics, right, and then to call them not Catholic, right? Not even the most atheistic or pagan or deplorable American politicians do this to each other. Think about that, right? Like, we have a lower moral standard for each other than American politicians have for each other. I mean, that's real life. And I would just ask people to, like, take a heart of, like, conversion for that, right?
Hey, I think that's an awesome kind of spot if you wanted to end that segment of the conversation there. I've got a bunch
Yeah.
of questions lined up,
Okay.
and
Yeah. What questions are good? It's a great time
cool.
to transition to that.
Cool. Tell you what, I'm going to pull up this question first from a channel member, Bella. And I do just want to say, first of all, I had to make channel memberships and I named all of mine. Please don't give me any money. Like that. That's what I named them. And Bella signed up anyway. So thank you. But she's been putting really great comments in here, and I actually want to pull up a couple of them. This is just the most recent one that I'm going to scroll all the way back up to the top. I'm going to take a stab at this one first, only because I'm the person who runs this channel. and then
Yeah.
and then
Well,
Thomas, I'll let you kind of address
it's
it
his
after.
fault,
It is.
you know.
So I will have you know that I actually did look up Catholics for Choice, and I know that the president of Catholics for Choice is a woman. What's her name? Her name is escaping me at this moment. I looked for ways to get in contact with her, and I couldn't find any. I want to talk to her. I would love to talk to more Catholic women just in general, whether the topic is abortion or not, and ex-Catholic women as well. If you look at the people that I've interviewed, they are overwhelmingly male. And that's not
Yep.
because I don't want to speak to women. Of course I do. Um, I just haven't had as much luck. Um, and hey, maybe that's my fault for not trying hard enough. And I will
Well,
also say that I don't talk about abortion on this channel. Like this is literally the first time I've done
yeah,
it. Um, and
that's true.
part of the reason why is because of exactly this kind of question. Like I don't know that it's necessary. So first of all, I'm definitely not going to represent the Catholic stance on abortion, right? Because I'm not Catholic. Um, but then secondly, like I'm not a woman either, right? So for those two reasons, I this is the first time I'm talking about abortion on my channel. And I'm actively trying to find either a Catholic or a not Catholic woman who wants to talk about abortion. I am trying, but it's just Catholics for Choice wasn't as easy to reach out to as I hoped they would be. But I'm working on it. I'm going to scroll to the top of the comments to go grab more questions. Do you want to say anything at all on that front?
So this, you know, I'm not. I'm going to be pretty brief on it, but like this is a problem a lot of people on the left have, and it's very toxic, right? Um, you ask them like, why aren't there, why isn't there a woman? One, we tried, and two, we're people too, right? I have women in my life, right? I vote. Kevin votes, right? We have moral decisions in this world, and when people say things like that, and I know there's part of it like that is good, well-meaning, and I totally I get that because you know what? There's so much hostility towards women in our culture right now, right? You can feel that you're just going to be like, I got to lash out at everything, and it's like very scary. But like, there are men who are on your side. You should like this is a good thing, and I know that like unfortunately part of the patriarchal system, right, means that a lot of men aren't going to listen to women. That doesn't mean that we don't need women's voices, right? But that doesn't mean that like, well, you're a man, so you can't talk. That's very dehumanizing, and it's very insulting to people, especially somebody who works so tirelessly to defend your behalf. Now, if you have like, hey, things like, hey, you know what, like, you know, why don't you bring up this issue, right? Or I would like to, add some extra perspective to that, right? Like as a woman, right? Like that's amazing. But this categorical error, like question of like, are you a woman or not? I have a problem with this.
Um, here's some quick thoughts. I don't want to dwell on this one too long because Bella's Bane actually had a bunch of points that I want to pull up.
Yeah. Well,
So and
those are the ones I want to get to.
okay. But just with regard to that, I don't think so. It like this attitude can become toxic, but I don't think that Bella's point is unfair. Like if you just look at my channel, the overwhelming majority of the guests on my channel have been men. So last week I had on Megan, who is a woman and is a survivor of the SSPV. I've had my friend Rosemary on the channel, and she's an ex-Catholic woman. That might be it. Literally the rest of my guests. So it's not unfair to ask me, like Kevin, where are all the women? That's not unfair. I don't think it's toxic to ask me specifically that. And Bella didn't say, like you are not allowed to talk about that.
Yeah.
All that she said is like, hey, like where are the women? And I think that's a fair point. So
Well, and maybe I'm misreading, the underlying tone of that. Because I have had people say that exact issue, right?
no, and I've seen it
Like,
too. I've seen it too.
and and I would just say is like, when people want to defend, your rights, like, why are you upset?
And I don't think Bella was.
Okay. I just like I have run into this problem, And I'm like, this is part of the reason why we have the pro choice movement. Like most people agree with it. Honestly, its biggest problem is messaging and just opening up people. But yeah, do you can still is this for oh
So this was aimed more at
Kevin?
me.
Yeah, Kevin. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll answer this, and then if you kind of want to give your commentary in my response, I will invite that. Um, so the answer, and I actually replied to Gloff in the comments. I said yes with an asterisk. So here's what that means. I look forward to the day where there are no abortions. I think we all do, and I think that we get there through better and better and better contraception. I don't think that we'll ever be perfect, and so to some extent, abortion might, and especially for like medical cases, right? Like abortion for medical cases is always going to have to be on the table, and so I'm quite happy to say that like if you think that me being pro-choice when there's like a medical necessity to do so makes me not pro-life, very well, I'm happy to be labeled not pro-life because of that. um Also, there's a famous thought experiment that I kind of want to share. And when I say this, I think a lot of people are like, whoa, why do you even call yourself pro-life? So let me just quickly walk through it. You can imagine a burning building. There's two rooms in there. You have time to run into one room and save the contents of that room, or the other, but not both. One room contains, and then insert your number of single-celled human beings in a test tube. Okay? And then in the other room, insert however many number of 1-year-old babies you would like. Let's say it's 1,000 single-celled humans in a test tube, in like 1,000 different test tubes in one room, and one 1-year-old human baby. I will save the 1-year-old human baby every single time that I have to make that decision. It's not even hard. And when I think about it, the number of human babies in test tubes doesn't even matter. Like it could be 1 million, it could be 10 million like babies in test tubes. Now, maybe the circumstances could make it different. Like, guess what? Like, those are the only 10 million like 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 humans that could possibly be born because some kind of crazy illness has made so like that is the entire future. But barring something like that, there's almost no number of single-celled human beings that could possibly come to one human baby for me. That's just when I think about how much I value those two different categories, that's what I do. And guess what? The same actually applies for me for most animals. Like I value one like living dog more than a single-celled human being. And a lot of pro-life people will hear that and they'll go like, "Whoa, you're not pro-life then, Kevin." Um and like maybe I'm not, maybe. Um but I kind of think of myself as like I'm about as pro-life as I am vegan, which is to say like I'm not vegan, but I am anti factory farming, and I'm not perfect about it, but I get most of my produce from a local farm, and I get most of my beef from a local farm. So like my friend owns the farm that I get all my beef from. I participate in community supported agriculture. Again, I'm not perfect, but I try. I oppose factory farming. I oppose abortion. Every now and then I shop at a grocery store and I buy factory farmed chicken. So that's a long-winded way of saying I call myself pro-life, but sometimes when I do, people get mad at me and they tell me I'm not really pro-life, and that's why I don't talk about it a lot. Um, so while I pull up the next question, Thomas,
So
do you have
Kevin,
thoughts there?
so Kevin, I think what this is part of the problem is that like you are pro-choice, right? And the reality is a lot of people who are pro-choice what like are just like you. Like there's this weird notion, right, that pro-choice people like abortion or think it doesn't have any moral consequences at all, or that we shouldn't work to reduce it. Like those people exist, but they're a small minority and they're on the far fringe. The overwhelming majority of people view, abortion as wrong. And I actually use the example of like factory farming, right? Like we all know it's wrong and it's gross and it's vile and like we would like to, to work as hard as we can to get rid of it, but also like practically speaking, like that's really hard. Like it's really, really hard, right? And trying to make a more humane agricultural system, like there's a limit to how much we can do to achieve that. And that's actually a very good analogy of how most people view the abortion issue. They're like, yeah, I look for a day that where there basically almost is no abortion. Um, and by the way, like, the way to achieve that is, Kevin, what you had said, and that is contraceptives, right? But of course, when you tell pro-life people this, you find out it was never about life, anyways. It's about making sure that people are punished for having sex, right? And so when you expand and allow access to contraceptives, which by the way, we already know this, right? Like women who are on using an IUD versus no, artificial contraceptives using something like artificial, like natural family planning. Um, Women who use natural family planning are 10 times more likely to have an abortion than women who are using an IUD.
Whoa. Whoa, really?
Yes.
Whoa. Wow.
And this is not, because here's the thing. Women don't have abortion because like they hate, like, people or something, right? People have abortions just because they didn't want to be a mom. It's unexpected, unplanned pregnancy. That is the number one cause and reason why people have abortions, right? And women who are using condoms, right? Versus women who aren't using any other artificial contraceptives, right? They're half as likely to get an abortion, right? And those who are on the pill are 5 times less likely to get an abortion. And by the way, when we look at women who use, effective forms of contraception, it lowers the amount of abortion rates even more than outright bans. And we know this because there are lots of places around the world where there are total bans, right? And a lot of those places actually have higher abortion rates, even here than the United States,
Wow. I did not know that.
especially in sub Saharan Africa, right? Where access to healthcare and contraceptives is very poor, right? Same thing, like, hyper conservative, macho, sexual ethic combined with poverty and a dysfunctional, access to healthcare, right? They have some of the highest abortion rates in the world, right? Which, by the other way, being, anti woke is not going to reduce the amount of abortions you have, right? Russia is a perfect example of this today. Um, you know, the way we achieve that is through effective, safe contraceptives. And that really should be a goal for everybody, right? Because abortion is ugly and gross. Like, even if you don't think, it's murder, if you don't think it's a person, right? If you just think, you know, it's just gross. And this, I actually like the example Kevin brought up with the factory farming thing, right? Factory farming, we're not killing anybody. No one is being killed in the factory farm,
Well,
but it's vile and it's gross and
animals are being killed.
exactly. And that's actually really the way that we view is that, like, human animals are being killed with abortion. That's why it's wrong, right? It's very disruptive and wicked for the woman to have to go through that process, to have doctors who chop these, little creatures up. Like, we shouldn't have to do that. And by the way, we don't need to. And this isn't some like radical viewpoint. Like, if we go over to Europe, right, most countries in Europe have, you can't get an abortion past 12 weeks, unless you have like very serious like medical, exceptions. The bans are at 12 weeks. And Europe is very secular and very progressive. But we can't achieve that until we accept the basic concept that we need women to have access to this option if need be, because you're not going to take care of their baby,
That's right.
right?
Um, the next question is from our friend Anton, and it's to you.
Oh,
He says if and only if this question makes sense to include in the larger conversation, which it kind of doesn't, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I like Anton. Um, so does Thomas have opinions on non-PIV intimacy? Is that something that can be squared with Catholic thought?
like in general.
So would any kind of
Okay, I'm
intimacy?
rereading. Okay,
Okay,
I got it. I
yeah.
just kind of
Trying to
reading the
keep
question.
it rated as PG-13 as possible
So,
without.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's also yeah. So this was the analogy that I was given, and I think it's sufficiently PG rated for is that when you buy the groceries, right? It really doesn't matter, if you take the scenic route home, right? All that matters is that wherever way you go around, right? You eventually get the groceries in the refrigerator.
Okay, so that's as long as the groceries wind up in the refrigerator, you're good with it. Is more or less the answer.
I mean, that's like the answer of like the Catholic answer to that. Of course, we can take back to the issue on like contraception. I think the other video that we did is much more of like on my perspective on the
Yeah,
issue,
yeah, I
right?
agree. Yeah. Okay, no need to rehash the entire other video. I've got a bunch of questions lined up. Um, Next one, this will be strictly for you. So this comes from a another Novus Ordo Catholic named Sede Vicante, and he says, so the question would be something like this. I'm going to rephrase it. Wouldn't it be a heresy that an early embryo has an animal soul, meaning like a non-rational soul, like a vegetative soul? Because that would lead to the heresy that Christ became a non-human animal before he became a human.
So actually, I get brought up this question, semi regularly. People bring up, the Christ incarnation question, and I always just give them Thomas Aquinas's answer, right? Because Thomas Aquinas answers this very specific objection. In fact, the objection to delayed ensoulment, that's what that the proper term is of like ensoulment happening after conception, right? This is the number one objection. So also way to go for finding like a good objection. um and Aquinas's answer to this is that because Christ is a divine person, unlike you and me, who are human persons, right? He is not, limited to his incarnation by the form of man, right? A human form, right? And in fact, this is why, of course, during transubstantiation, right? Like there isn't a human form there, right? The host is not an embryo, you know, it's the form of bread.
The accidents do not change. Yeah.
Yeah. And but we believe that the incarnation happens there in the bread, right? And not only happens in, but in fact now it ceases to be bread, and like this is God. Even though and it's not just God in his divine nature, we say his soul and his body, right? The soul, right, is that he's ensouled there. Like his human soul is there in the Eucharist, and his body is there. And yet the form of the human body doesn't exist. And now this is only possible because Christ is a divine person. And so Thomas Aquinas thinks that because of this, is that, his opinion is that actually Christ was ensouled at the moment of conception. However, he is the only human being that has ever happened to.
Interesting. Okay. Okay.
He does connect it with the whole, Eucharist thing.
Okay. Our friend Honestly Atheist had a question. He did have to run, but this comes from earlier, so it's like a little bit disconnected. But let me kind of phrase this as a question. So, Thomas,
Mm.
would you be so we're not talking about morals, we're only talking about like legislation. Are you okay with taking the physiological capacity for awareness as the dividing line for when we should make abortion illegal?
So, so I have my own personal opinion, right? But I think it's like really important when Aquinas addresses this issue is this question is not answerable through philosophy, right? When ensoulment actually happens, we cannot determine it through philosophy. Now, he gives his reasonable guess, and that's based on tradition and kind of some like examining of, science and common reason, right? He basically says, well, here is when it is most probable, not when it does happen, right? And for me, generally, I really see is like, right around the end of the first trimester is a pretty reasonable place for us to say, we're not just talking about, an animal, right? Like this is a person who has any eternal destiny. And I have lots of reasons why I think that. Um, you know, one of the ones I think it's like personally just like very important to me is that of all conceived embryos naturally, right? 40% of them are never born. Never born. And that's very unusual. So this is not common in most higher mammals.
Really?
Most higher mammals have a much lower or much more successful. Human beings very specifically evolved to, lose most of our conceived embryos. And 90% of those that are lost happen before the first trimester. The first trimester also happens to be like that 40 days period, which, the ancients have always looked as like there's something there. And if we look at modern science, right, like, I mean, there are like, around like 12-ish weeks, right? I mean, like you have all the differentiated cells and, distinct, organelle forms, right? Like, and so there's something here that's like, this matters. And then there's the practical issue, right? Is that, and this is why I think maybe 15 weeks is maybe more, for practical reasons. But like, 15 weeks, over 90% of all abortions that happen prior to, Roe being turned over happened before then. So it's also about access too. Like, I mean, if we want to make sure that, women have this option, right, around this period, it seems the most appropriate.
Cool.
Just kind of all that. But the thing is, like, we don't know. And so it's ultimately the mother's call. And I think this is the thing that, like, like this is so important to realize, right? Like, no one will have a good answer. No one. And that's why we give the choice to the mother, right? Because the mother and her family and her community, like, she has to be the one to decide. And I think it's almost like too simple, like, because part of like, it doesn't matter really what my opinion is on like when, this is or isn't, right? Like, it's not my kid and it shouldn't be my choice. I shouldn't be dictating to you when that's happening. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, we got a new question.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there, but
Oh,
this is just something that Bella's Bane added earlier when we were talking about like the ugliness of some of the activities that we see on the pro-life side. She said the pro-life side blew its victory, and now there's a backlash, and hearts have been hardened. In my experience, that is exactly the case.
well, I would make the argument, the pro-life, side is never serious. They blew their victory the moment they started. Um, because it was never about life. It's always been a veneer for punishing people for having sex, and to put women back as second-class citizens, and to attack the poor and people of color. It is the political galvaning tool and the mechanism to achieve many of the similar outcomes of segregational South, now that segregation was no longer a political like rallying call, right? And so like I don't think it blew it. It blew it once it started. But obviously I understand like specifically now, like they can't pivot, right? Like even basic stuff like, hey, like we should have like Medicare for women who, uh want to choose to have their babies, right? Like we'll cover, right? We'll pay for your hospital, bills to have a baby. Even that's like, really? I mean,
Yeah.
like, and this is also too like, then I don't have like. Here's the thing, the reason why a lot of pro-choice people always come up with like they'll quote and they're like, oh, is this pro-life? Because that is like the Catholic like point, right? Is that being pro-life, right? You know, according to catechism, a respect from all life, right? And to say that because you respect some life in some way, therefore you have a claim to ignore all other claims on respecting life, that's not a Catholic position. And so as Catholics, like we should decide, well, which one is more life-giving? And of course, obviously, the pro-life side, like, um, let's just say they can't convert, conservatives in, freaking Alabama.
Yeah, it
They're
seems
not buying it.
it seems to be a losing issue, like politically anyway.
Oh, it'll destroy the Republican Party. I mean, it's their deal with the devil, right? It's their Faucian bargain. They were a non-party before then. They got political power for this lie and this fantasy. And now the devil's come due, and he wants his paycheck, and it will destroy the whole Republican Party.
So here's a good question for you, and if you don't know who Dustin Crummett is, then the answer is just
Nope.
going to be
Um, no, I've never heard of this person.
he's a
I don't know. Are they
philosopher.
somebody famous? Are they an online personality? I have no idea who this
So
is.
Dustin Crummett is a philosopher who has debated Trent Horn on the topic of abortion. Um,
Oh, okay.
Dr. Dustin Crummett, I believe, is a Christian. I don't believe he's Catholic. I believe he's a non-Catholic Christian. Um,
Well, I can already tell you he's not Catholic. Not
well,
being
fair
debating
enough.
Trent
Fair enough. Um, but yeah. Um, uh, you might, like, if you ever dug into the work of Dustin Crummett, you might find that you agree with him. I'm trying to recall the debate that he did with Trent Horn. Um, yeah,
Look, in a certain way, I don't care what the debate is,
yeah,
right? What this what I mean is that, like, Catholics are overwhelmingly pro-choice. 70% of Catholics are pro-choice. I don't have to convince anybody, right? What we have to convince is that, like, you can be Catholic and you need to be proud about your opinions, because you know what? The reality is that there are a lot of people in America who have made you feel like your soul is online when that is not the case, right? And so really all we have to do is just, like, let Catholics, let yourself be who you are. Like, you believe in being pro-choice because you wanted to defend the church's teaching on life, not just for some, but for all. You believe in the freedom of conscience for all people, right? That is universal teaching of the church, the primacy of conscience, right? The respect for the human dignity of their rights. These are Catholic principles, and you should not be ashamed or afraid to be upholding Catholic principles as a pro-choice Catholic.
cool. Um, Question for you from No One Someone: how much of the pro-life sentiment is motivated by a desire to reform sexual norms? I think more than sexual mores to be more conservative. I think
More,
norms to be more
yeah.
conservative. I think.
100% of it.
See, I'm not willing to go that far. I do think that there's a
No, because the thing is, the rest of it is then about racism.
see. I'm not willing to go that far. And let me tell you why. Um, as somebody who was like in the thick of it, I can tell you for sure that there are plenty of people who legitimately believe that it's murder. And I think that the point that, like, the fact that we don't treat it the same way is a good one. But you may have not met the people that I did, the people who literally bombed abortion clinics. Um, and the kinds of people who went to my church, they were serious about it. And maybe they're a minority, but if they're just non-zero,
Extraordinary. And here's the thing. I'll be totally honest. Like, I think, like, obviously a lot of people think it's wrong, right? People have very strong moral feelings that, like, abortion is wrong, right? And they want it, to be limited for that reason. But all those people are pro-choice people, right? Like, we shouldn't have a total ban on this stuff, right? We need to work towards a place where we reduce it. The people who want to have, total bans, right? they want total bans because they're angry and believe society is falling apart because people can have sex and not have the threat of having their lives destroyed
That's
on
right.
second notice. That's really what it is, right? And that's the difference. Again, this is, I think, Kevin, and too, is like, you should come out as pro-choice. Okay. And this is part of my, like, what I want to try to help people is like, if you don't think that like all of it should be banned, right? You're pro-choice, right?
Yeah.
And not all and once we accept that basic principle, then we can have an argument like, well, should it be at like 12 weeks, or should it be at 6 months, or what kind of other, like, healthcare and, like, support do we need for families, and all those discussions we can have because we're all pro-choice. The pro-life is, the terrorist with, its, bomb strapped to him and saying, right, like, unless you agree with this policy, you kill babies.
So honestly, atheist chimed back in with like a related question, tagging me and saying, you don't think it's possible for people to be led by motives about sexual mores without explicitly realizing it? And like, yeah, no, that's
I
a
don't
good,
think most people realize it.
and that's a good
I don't
point.
think most do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good
I
point
think
that
it's good.
people might say one thing, but they're actually led by another. But here's kind of my response. Yeah, it's possible, but like without some kind of like study that like
I
analyzed.
have it.
Do
I
you?
have it, Kevin. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So here's the thing: when it comes to being self-identified as conservative, of being pro-life, and do you believe sex outside of marriage is wrong? It's always the same 35% of the population. All answer those questions all exactly the same.
Okay, that is kind of
Okay?
weird, right?
It's not weird. It's always been the point. Their real objection is to sex outside of marriage. That has always been the motivating issue. Nancy Pelosi, she knew this, right? When she came out and talked about it, it's like, you have to understand these people. It's not about life. It's the spear to the tip of their agenda. These people have problem with sex outside of marriage and contraception, right? Divorce and remarriage. There's a whole other list of issues that they actually care about. But we like pretend it's for the babies.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's so disingenuous, and it really is, like, and that's the thing, like, we are dealing with, like, people are dealing like, oh, the big lie. I'm like, no, the pro-life movement is the big lie. It was the first big lie. Do you, like, want to go back to the white patriarchy where the white man, ruled over the others, including the women and the children and all the browns and everyone else? Like, wasn't that good? Well, we can't say that anymore because the Constitution says we have to treat everybody equal, right? But you still have those beliefs. Like, that's the thing. When we forced the South, when we invaded the South with soldiers at gunpoint, and we're like, "Hey, you should let this little black child come to your school," and they're like, "No," and I'm like, "Well, if you don't, we'll shoot you," like, because that's what we had to do in order to allow this to happen, right? You think that they're like the next day they're like, I get it. You know what? I was wrong the whole time. No, those opinions still hold on. And this is the project. And
Let,
this is why, like, you go back to the Southern Baptist Convention, right? And before Roe, right? Back in the 60s. And they did an interview. Again, this is the Southern Baptist Convention. They did an interview of the pastors and whether they thought that all abortion, right, was wrong and like should be banned. 70% of those pastors said it was okay.
when was
Abortion.
this? The 1970s?
Would have, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. They knew. They knew, like, yeah, of course. Like, obviously, sometimes like abortions are like permittable, and like obviously, like, that's the same thing when Roe was made. It was mostly made by Republicans on the Supreme Court. Right? Like, this was a settled legal issue. It was a fabricated concept to dupe Catholics, honestly, because Catholics really care about human life in the womb, right? and we have like deep moral, issues about this, and we like babies, right? And it was like, how could the evangelicals convince us to give up? Because that's the other thing too. Back in 1960, right? Like if you were a Catholic, you were Democrat.
Right. But the parties were
Like,
different back then too.
but they really weren't, right? They really weren't. You know, and this is the thing, like the whole Republican concept of lower taxes and aggressive foreign policy and no welfare state and against all these like rights for women and people of color, like that has always been the Republican Party for easily the past 100 years, right? And Democrats were, Catholics, and Catholics were, Democrats. And how do you convince those people to come and vote against otherwise deeply anti-Catholic viewpoints? Right. And I know this, right? Like if you listen to like real Catholics, like they do not like this whole like let's strip down the state to be absolute minimalistic. Right. Like that is a deeply anti-Catholic stance. And like the whole issue of the pro-life was how do we convince people to slowly give up their Catholic culture, their principles, and get them to vote for us. Both of the parties are war hawks. That is, well, not today, not anymore.
No?
No, the Republicans are super anti-war hawks now.
Just wait until they're back in power. Um, let
Oh,
me.
well, the thing is, they want to invade Mexico. That's the
Yeah,
real.
there you go.
They don't want. We should be fighting wars overseas. We should be fighting wars on our border.
That's right. Let me try my hand at kind of defending the pro-life movement for a little bit and just get your thoughts.
Okay.
Um, so we can look at some data that says that like there's a super high correlation between people who think that sex outside of marriage is morally wrong and people who are pro-life. But what if it's the case that these people who find themselves first believing that abortion is wrong look around at who else thinks that abortion is wrong, and they only find the pro-lifers accusing them of like only believing it because they think that sex outside of marriage is wrong, and the only people who agree with them are the Catholics who do legitimately believe that sex outside of marriage is wrong. So then they find companionship with these Catholics, and then over time they kind of just assimilate their views to the people around them. That doesn't strike
That's
me
why
as
I brought up
something
the
that's
Baptist
super. It
issue.
doesn't strike me as something that's super far fetched. We see this with radicalization of young men online turning like alt right and stuff like that. It's like the left will have no capability to actually have a conversation in the first place. Kind of like what you were saying earlier with like why are there no women on the panel? I think that point is a good one, and I think it could apply here too. I'm interested to get your thoughts.
I don't see I don't quite understand the connection between those two last points.
Um, the last 2 points just being like how this does happen, like people wind up adopting like more and more radical beliefs.
Oh, I kind of okay, yeah, okay. I'm trying to kind of understand. Yeah, obviously this is part of that, but this is also why I brought up like this wasn't the world that we lived in pre-Roe, right? Like, I mean, conservatives knew that abortion is sometimes morally like permittable, right? That the law shouldn't get involved with this, right? This is why I brought up it's the Republicans. It's the Republicans on the Supreme Court who made Roe happen. It's the Southern Baptist Convention, like the Southern Baptist Convention, back in 1970 or whatever the year was before Roe that they did the survey, right? 70% of the pastors were like, yeah, it's okay. It's invented. And this is the thing that like this is also why like people don't quite get this. Is like, people who think they're like, oh, we're conservative, we're traditional, like we're based in the ancient. I'm like, no, you're not. Like this is a very modern phenomena. It's more modern than the hippies. I mean, this is the kind of stuff where like this movement and this obsession about this, is very recent phenomena. Now, in terms of like that radicalization process, like that is the point of this connection with the reaction against the sexual revolution, right? People had the experience of sexual revolution, right? And they're like, I don't like this. And so we have to give up on our traditions and our way of life and how society was structured. And we have to break those down because it led to this. And so we have to like reimpose a radicalized order to stop it from happening again. And that's really like that's where the pro-life issue and the being against sex outside of marriage, like how do you deal with that when you have contraceptives available, right? Like this is their answer, right? They're like, well, let's do like the Russian roulette, that'll help the issue.
Yeah, and so I certainly don't deny that that could be the case for even lots of them. But I'm kind of with pick and choose here. He says, when you
But
insist that everyone who disagrees with you harbors cynical motives, you become incapable of reaching people. That is kind of how I like the same.
this is not
Let me get this
I
thought
know.
out. The
I don't think
same.
it's
Let me
a
one
cynical
thought.
point.
One thought. The same. Like, hey, men aren't allowed to talk about abortion at all is kind of this. It's like it's to me. I view it very similarly to if you don't agree with me, then you have bad motives.
That's not this is important. It's not that I think people have bad motives, right? And this is the process of deconstruction is we have worldviews and assumptions, right, about ourselves that we don't understand, right? This is something that we enculturate, and there's unthought, assumptions behind this stuff. And this is why I bring out the historical standpoint, because a lot of people who are pro-life just assume, well, I'm part of how I have that label is like, well, hasn't everyone always been like this forever? Of like, what does this worldview produce and what does it like lead to? Then you can self-examine your own beliefs and be like, oh, wait a minute, like wait, do I really kind of like think that, or do I like just have this like title because like I inherited it, or well, actually, yeah, I do. My real problem really is with just people having sex outside of marriage, and I didn't quite like realize that this was part of the system and framework I lived in. That like, oh, that's kind of our answer to it is banning abortions. Then you can have a rational inquiry. I'm like, well, if my real problem is with sex outside of marriage, and like is banning abortion, is that a good way to achieve that? And you could have your own criticism. So that's the thing is like it's not that you have a bad motive, right? It's like your worldview is not yours. It came from somewhere. Where did it come from?
And it's a don't let me put words in your mouth, but what I think you're saying is that the people whose secret motive for being pro-life is actually more just like they want to punish women for having sex outside of marriage is it's not like that is their like deep down they know that this is how it is. They don't even realize that this is what is motivating their pro-life position. But if you took away that, they might come to reflexively realize that that is what had been motivating their position all along. But while they held it, they were just
Yes.
unaware. Is that kind of
Yeah, it depends for different people.
okay?
Some people are more conscious of it, right? Some people aren't,
Okay.
right? So, and this is the thing is like we use very negative terminology to help break through the frame that people are in. But like, a lot of people are it's much more subtle, just like, well, obviously, like women should be vulnerable because they could get pregnant, or they are vulnerable because they get pregnant, right? And like, but like, what is that assumption, right? And that's assumption that like, well, yes, as a woman, right, like it's part of the natural order that you have less rights and freedoms and liberties, right? That's really what that means, right? Even though it's just that kind of attitude of like, well, I shouldn't ever have to like stop my life on account of like being pregnant. But for women, that's like that's what they are. That's what makes them women. That's what makes them noble. That's why I love and respect them, right? Is because they have this second class status. And that
Um,
should be reflected in the law.
I realize we've been going for over 2 hours now, but
Yeah.
if it's all right, two last ones from Bella. They're both going to be quick. So I don't actually know who Antonio Spadero is, but didn't Antonio Spadero call the Catholic Evangelical Alliance an ecumenism of hate? Um,
Yes. Yes. This is a really good, and that's in a lot of ways like exactly what this is, right? Because here's the thing: Catholics and evangelicals absolutely hate each other. Absolutely hate each other. I mean, not even half, 2/3 of Catholic media is, why are the Protestants wrong, right? And so, it is this ecumenicalism of hate where there's these people who really hate each other, and they overcome their hate, and that's right. We all kind of come together, right? By hating of the others. We conglomerate, right? Like you know, like a really good example is all of like the horny bros, get added into this, somehow, right? Um, Muslim extremists even, right? Because they're like, well, we all also hate women and think that their life should be, at any moment we could just take away their rights because they were having sex. Because if you have sex, like that's a justification for spontaneously at any time we should be able to take your rights away.
Yeah. I think last question, before I just kind of give you the microphone one last time for closing remarks. Um, and Bella says that Kevin should read the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision from '92. It really strikes the right balance between the interests of women and those of the state regarding the regulation of abortion. Here's my commitment: I'm going to read through that within the next 3 days. I will read through it. Um, and Thomas, do you have any thoughts about the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision from 1992?
Specifically, no. Um, for me, I think is that like all of these discussions are really great, but we first have to get to a place where we accept, right, that women should have bodily autonomy and have the right to decide when and where and if they have children. Till we get to that point, all the other complicated, interesting, and honestly very serious questions can't be addressed. And I think in order to get to there, right, we as Catholics have to be very loud and vocal and persistent, right? That we can have a alternative perspective to the pro-life position, because that is not the only Catholic position. That is not the only thing that's defending life. And because like even that's even true in politics. Like the only reason the pro-life movement exists is because of Catholics, right? We joined the Southern haters and we said, well, we'll give you our vote. Um, it really comes down to us. And we need to like break out of that like place, because that's the other thing too is like we don't have to convince anybody to be pro-choice. Like the overwhelming percentage of society is in America, right? Including Catholics. 70% of Catholics are pro-choice. If you just so
Yeah.
like we have to be able to come out and be confident in that.
Yeah. I have thoughts on like the popularity, but I think if I open up another can of worms, we'll go for another hour. So
Yeah.
rather than doing that, I'll hand the microphone back to you one more time, and I'll
Okay.
say closing thoughts. Also, where can
Yeah.
we find you? I do have your Twitter linked in the description down below.
Yeah.
And like what's going on, what's new with you, all that good stuff before we close out.
Yeah. So I'm Thomas Polega on Twitter. It's just at Thomas Polega, just spelled just that way. Um, and so I'm a student going to Indiana University in computer science. Um, and just finish up the semester, so that's great. That's part of why I'm on here. Got some free time to go and chat, and then probably also people notice it's also why I like spent a lot more time on Twitter these last like week or two. um but my really message is for like everybody, right? Is when it comes down to the intimidation, right? The church doesn't excommunicate you for being pro-choice. It hasn't. It's not going to, right? Now the church, you know, might have its, preferences for maybe certain things, but like, just remember, if Mussolini can go to communion and be a Catholic in good standing, you as a pro-choice Catholic can be, right? And you can let people know. And that's empowering, even as a identity, right? Like Catholics suffer from a lot of Catholic guilt, and a lot of shame, right? When you come out and it's like, yeah, of course I'm pro-choice. People asking like, why? Because I'm Catholic. Because I believe in universal, like, a primacy of conscience. Like that is the basis of all Catholic moral teaching, is the primacy of conscience, right? The next part, right, is we believe in the human dignity and rights and body of every human being, right? No one has a right to take away your bodily autonomy, your dignity as a person, right? Nobody has a right to that. That's a Catholic principle. And then of course the other thing is that, like, when it comes to supporting and respecting life, right? This idea that like there's, the pro-lifers have some monopoly on like what, well, you're not defending life unless you follow this very specific program. No, the church has never said that there is a specific program, right? Just rather that we need to help support the life of all human beings. And by the way, like this is of course, like, it's a Catholic thing, but like that's not even like Catholic, right? Like that's just like that should be the goal of everybody, is to maximize the life and respect that we give to every human being, right? Um, and the other thing when it comes to the question of like ensoulment, right? Like realize that, like, again, it's not until, 1917 that the church taught that it was murder in all circumstances, in abortion for the mother. 1917 was the first time. It's not part of the natural law. In the Torah, right? The Torah allows for abortions. The only time in the Old Testament when it forbids an abortion is an involuntary abortion. And then it doesn't even apply if it's an early term involuntary abortion, right? And so, like, if Moses, when he gave the law, or like when God gave Moses the law, he made Israel pro-choice. If it's good enough for God and his people, it's good enough for you, right? It's good enough as a universal standard, right? This idea that like we have to ban this, right, because it is a clear moral unambiguity is not true. It's just not. Now, is it evil? Probably. I mean, I feel it is. I mean, that's, I think it's wrong, and I would like to do everything I can not to have an abortion, like from my partner, right? Like I'd really like that. But also, like, as a man, like I also don't think I should get the final say. Like even though it's my kid, potentially, I like it's not my body, it's not my dignity, it's not my freedom, it's not my liberties, right? And if like I don't feel confident to like dictate that decision to my significant other, why should I be dictating that to millions of strange women that I know nothing about? I mean, it really is that simple, right? And kind of like, and again, the thing is like, again, if people ask you a question, right, try to intimidate you, right? Why is it that Pope Francis, accepted Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi in their political hot point when this issue was being discussed? They were accepted to Rome to have communion. Why is it that the millions and millions and millions and millions of Catholics who are pro-choice, they don't get denied communion? There's no canon. There's no part of the catechism that says that you can't receive communion, right? Don't listen to the words of the bishops. Watch what they do, right? Watch what they do. and they've been doing the same thing forever. And that is like, obviously, they say with the words whenever a Catholic says, like, well, you have to be pro life, remember, it's like, well, I would like you to be pro life. Just like I would like you to be a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. And the last word I would have to say is for those who are pro life, right? Realize that you're playing with the souls in the church. You have very strong moral opinions about this, and I understand that. I get that, right? But when you take your moral, standings and your positions, right, and you say, well, if you don't agree with me on this, right, I'm going to chase you all out of the church. You're endangering those souls that you're kicking out, right? And those souls they'll be on your conscience, not theirs, right? And like I said, it's like even when it comes to our American politics, right? Our politicians treat each other better and more respect and dignity than we Catholics treat each other over this issue. That's how ugly it is. And like we have to repent of this stuff because it's a sin. And remember that this is an obsession of Americans in the last 60 years, and that's it. That's the only time in history that this is a major concern. That like somehow that you can't be Catholic and be pro-choice. This is a fantasy of the American mind, and it's a sick fantasy, unfortunately. And we have to overcome this and repent from this.
Hey, I think that was a really good summary of tonight. If I can kind of tell you my two key takeaways, well, I guess
Yeah.
one would be Bella kind of put it
Bingo.
pro-choice is not pro-abortion. And then if I
But
could,
for real, Bellis, thank you.
this, and then the other thing that's kind of sticking out to me as like the second key takeaway is watch what they do, not what they say, is kind of, because I think, well, I think that was like the other
Yeah.
kind of key point is what if
Yeah.
yeah. Thomas, thank you for another very electric conversation. This one is sure to generate just as much, if not more, conversation as last time. The chat was very lively today, and I expect the conversations down below will
Okay.
be even more
I could
lively.
see. So I think that was like it was unfortunate. Like, so for if all of you guys are going crazy, I had no reference to see that. Kevin
Sometimes it's
hoards
better
all of
that
it.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally oblivious. I'm just here alone in my room, just talking to my friend Kevin. So
Yeah. Believe me, if I try not to look at it honestly, like I try to keep half of one eye on it, and otherwise I
yeah,
ignore it. But it was lively, and I expect the comment section down below to be even more lively.
okay.
So Thomas, this was awesome. Thanks again for coming on, and until next time.
Awesome.